Sledgefist was eager and headstrong, he knew, and Hobblefoot loved machines and moving parts, but it was premature, wasn't it? Why had they made such choices? There was simply so much to do. Who was to say Jorvig knew better? He had only just arrived. He fell asleep thinking about it all. The next morning, he found Savvy preparing to venture out on foraging duty. The dwarf was tying up his thick, hobnailed boots with laces that had been broken, retied, and spliced many times. Savvy grinned up at Jorvig. Hobblefoot was already hauling sacks of crushed quartz to the sluices. No one had thought to assign Jorvig a job. "Going to check the weirs?" Jorvig asked. He thought he might come and lend a hand. "No weirs, just a pole and fly," Savvy answered, standing up. The pale light of dawn was just brightening the entrance to the adit. "Why haven't you made weirs on the river?" "Well, we talked of it, but if the forager spends a whole week or more trying to build them, what will the others eat in the meantime? It's hard enough to find food day by day." "Then more than one should forage or build it." "No one wants to stop mining. That's why we came." "You can't have a claim without food." And Jorvig knew by observation that they had been using valuable animal fat to make oil so they could keep mining, rather than eating it to keep from slowly starving. "We've got to tighten our belts until we can strike," Saviarm replied. "Then we can send back to Deep Cut." It was possible, though far from ideal, to travel the Red Ridges in the winter. It snowed at these elevations. Still, winter would make foraging many times harder, and if they didn't strike before the weather turned, based on how the miners already looked, they would be skeletal come spring. Jorvig was a little disappointed to find the claim poorly organized, but he was not entirely surprised. He'd known his older brother and eldest cousin his whole life, after all. Those two avoided fighting by avoiding decisions whenever possible, choosing their areas of influence apart. It was true they were friends, but both were granite-headed. "I'll work on Weird," he said. "Look, Chargrim, if it was easy, we'd have done it. But the river isn't a cut and the current is rapid. It's no Kara and Dal." "We're dwarves," Jorvig said with a grin, trying to make light of the difficulty. "I'll take a look anyway." Savvy walked with Jorvig along the path above the dried-up creek bed that led back to the river. The dwarves of Deep Cut had named the river Kithlug on maps, which just meant east because the maps of the area showed it turning to head east of the ridges, another 30 miles below them. That wasn't true. The maps were less than reliable in this section of the Red Ridges. As far as they knew, there were no other claims this far. It was why Jorvig had grown more and more concerned during his weeks of following runes through passes and then along the river. Why so far? Enthusiasm, he now realized. Savvy had told the truth about the river cut. Sheer, weathered, and cracked rock dropped down 10 or 15 feet to the rushing water, white foam flecking the jumbled boulders in the river course. The dried creek bed joined through a deep gouge out of the rock, but Jorvig could see upstream another 100 yards where the cut lessened to something more like 5 feet and the river widened. There were gaps where he knew he could make a way down to the water. With the current rushing through this cut, weirs just above these rapids should prove effective. "Right there," Jorvig said, pointing. Savvy shrugged. "I fish below the cut. There are pools there." He nodded downstream. Jorvig nodded in return, but they parted ways, Savvy carrying his pole and buckets. Jorvig had brought his tools and rope with him, and he picked his way upstream instead. There wasn't even much of a beaten path there, but it was not hard going between the pines that clustered along the river. As he'd seen, the river widened, and the banks became less a sheer drop and more a mass of boulders. There was even a game trail leading down to the edge, and it only took half an hour to form rough steps and move some awkward stones to create a crude stairway to the water. Shoals of gravel lay beneath the water's surface, and he saw the prints of deer, raccoons, weasels, and other creatures of the forest in the dried silt just above the waterline. He set his tools down, took his axe, and walked a short distance into the forest. Pine was not ideal for a weir, but he found a few cedars and stripped the lower branches, cut the branches into lengths, and sharpened the ends for stakes. He carried a few bundles back to the water's edge. One branch he kept long as a staff, then he stripped naked. Jorvig had never built a fish weir before. He, like the others, had apprenticed as a miner, starting in the coal mines of Deep Cut. Hobblefoot, the eldest by some 10 years, had additional apprenticeship as a mine engineer, working with pumps and water wheels and even steam. Despite never having built a weir before, Jorvig knew the basics. The young dwarves had interrogated every current or former prospector and hunter they could find, long before they'd made solid plans to come to the Red Ridges. Jorvig had perhaps been more enthusiastic about those interviews than the others, and he had continued when they lost interest. Jorvig tied the rope about his waist and secured it to a tree, then took the staff and ventured into the frigid mountain waters. Swimming was not a particular gift of the dwarves. They tended to sink. He had to make sure to keep his feet under him. He used the staff to test the riverbed for holes. The current in the center was strong, but at that point the river was nearly 40 yards wide, narrowing downstream to barely 10 yards at the cut, rushing and noisy. 2/3 across, the river bottom sunk away into a deep, fast-flowing trench. He would only be able to make a weir on the near side. After thoroughly exploring the river bottom and tripping a few times, he climbed shivering back onto the near bank and let himself warm in the sun. It would be a cold day, surely. The first step to building the weir was to drive a close line of stakes into the stony river bottom, forming a long U shape facing upstream, with the tops of the U curled inwards, leaving a relatively small entrance. The near side was comprised in part by the shore. Driving the stakes took him all morning. Even with his hammer, it was difficult to drive the stakes deep enough to hold. He used longer branches intertwining between the stakes to hold them steadier. Always he kept the rope tied to himself, and often he had to climb from the water to warm up, even though dwarves do not easily grow cold or hot. The mountain water was frigid. Once the stakes were in place and secure, he began the true labor, stacking a barrier of rock to reinforce the stakes. Thankfully, there was no shortage of boulders and cobbles and all size of loose stone along the river. It took him a week of days working alone. Dwarves are no swimmers, dense and prone to sinking as they are, and they do not love to be in the water. Yet, Jorvig pushed himself until at last the weir was complete. Now, a fish seeking calm waters would swim inside the weir and yet find it more than difficult to find a means of escape. The weir would gather fish for them, even when the dwarves were elsewhere. With only a net on a long pole, they could gather sustenance from the wilds. He hoped it worked. It was his first contribution to establishing the claim, an attempt to prove his value. Though none had spoken to him about it, the other dwarves all knew that Jorvig was building a weir. They let him, nor did they tell him what to do after he finished. He wasn't sure if that was because he was the youngest and a latecomer or for some other reason, but they did not press him into the cycle of working that they had decided upon for themselves before the winter. Jorvig didn't question it. He would have loved to swing the pick, but there were pressing matters. Starvation was not how he wanted to die. He did let himself stand and stare at his finished work after he'd gotten dressed from the last wade. Even before it was fully finished, it had begun to trap fish, and that encouraged him. Now it was done. He saw the dark, lurking form of a rilli beneath the surface. After wringing the water from his beard, Jorvig headed back to the mine. The tailings pond had backed up even further into the dell after the rain that had fallen the day before last. Pine trees rose from within the still water, their needles turning yellow as they drowned. The trees would die and their wood would rot. They should have been cut before the dell was flooded. Now the pond would have to be drained in order to cut them. It was a waste of wood. His brother and the others had been too eager, too ahead of themselves. Gilka-wise, an old dwarf might have said. Gilka was the dwarvish word for a dwarf before their coming of age. Or Rundal. Too eager. Too eager. Jorvig remembered sitting with the Hardfell brothers in a miner's stew hall in Deep Cut. "We're not going," the eldest, Greel Hardfell, said. Greel was an adherent to that scandalous sect of young dwarves who insisted on using their hidden names in public, causing outrage among the older dwarves of Deep Cut. Despite that, he was a competent miner and a skilled gem cutter, what's more. The sect referred to themselves as the Named of Strength, believing in the power of their true names to guide them in life. but for some reason only if they claimed their names by being open about them. It was strange to Jorvig, but they had grown up together in the same old deep-cut drift with Sledgefist and Hobblefoot and the rest, and they had not forsworn their friendship when the two Hardfell brothers took to the new fad. "What do you mean?" Jorvig asked. "They were supposed to leave in just 3 weeks." "Yet, at least," Khalif, the younger brother, said. "If we delay, we risk the onset of winter. We don't know how far up the river they staked the claim." "Look," Greel said, wiping his mouth after the drink he'd just taken from his pewter mug. "We may still come, but not until we see some shine." "But you promised Sledgefist." "No," Greel said. "I told him that if the Enterprise was producing quality gems, I'd come and cut on sight for a share. I never said I'd come before then." "That's not how he said it to me," Jorvig answered. "I know, but I did not feel like arguing with him. You know how he can be when he gets an idea." Jorvig stared at Greel. The dark-featured dwarf was hardly one to complain about a stubborn idea, adherent as he was to the named of strength. "They will have struck. Between them, they'll have struck. There's ore and gems in the Red Ridges." The Hardfell brothers glanced at each other, sharing a wordless thought. "There is no Rinlin," Cleef said. It was the dwarvish word for captain. Jorvig made a confused face, scrunching his forehead. "They have both Sledgefist and Hobblefoot." "Two Rinlin are not better than one," Greel said. "You know the saying," Cleef added. Jorvig did know the saying. Many miners, but one captain. "Let them bring us a sample this summer or in the fall. We can go together next spring then." "But they won't. They'll wait for you this year." Greel shrugged. "Next, then." Jorvig leaned back, his drink forgotten. That meant it could be 2 years before they departed for the mine. He'd have to hire himself out to mine coal or salt until then, but who would take a journeyman miner on a 2-year oath? 5 was considered short. "I'm going," he said. "Don't be daft," Cliff answered. And there he was, lost in thought, staring at a tailings pond full of rotting pines. They hadn't struck yet. If Greel had come, he'd have found no cutting to do. Sledgefist and Hobblefoot had been so eager, so sure they could find a good seam near the surface. They'd have a pile waiting for Greel by spring, they'd said. Greel's skepticism was not unfounded, but Jorvig had eaten up the older dwarf's assurance. He sighed and headed into the audit for the night. He hadn't even begun to dig a sleeping alcove. There were so many things to do. They needed to be able to cut chimneys and vents, which meant they needed drill bits. Long, sharpened rods of iron with the steeled bit heads used to punch through the rock with sledgehammers. But to make bits and drills, they needed to smelt ore in a bloomery, then forge it, then dig out new passageways and chambers to relocate their forge and smeltery inside. And all that was far too much work for a claim that had not yet struck. The next morning, Jorvig stepped out of the storeroom where he'd been sleeping on the stone, and met Hobblefoot in the audit. "Good waking," the dwarf said. Hobblefoot had what they called early streaks, which meant that lines of dirty gray had begun to grow through his beard at a young age. He was only 56 or 57 years old. This week, Hobblefoot was responsible for foraging. "Good waking," Jorvig answered. He noticed Hobblefoot was carrying a fishing net on a long pole. No one had said anything to him directly about the weir, but when Jorvig and Hobblefoot stepped out of the adit, the older dwarf headed to the southwest, following a shortcut to the weir Jorvig had beaten during his labors there. Jorvig didn't much mind that no one had said anything about the weir. The dwarves had a saying, and it translated roughly to, "Best is the praise of another in absence." It wasn't the way of dwarves to speak praise directly, but no doubt the others had spoken of it together if they thought of Jorvig's labors as worthy. "Let another's lips praise you," was another saying his father had often repeated. In other words, don't talk about your own work. As happy as he was with the improvement, it would in no way supply all their needs. 5 working dwarves required a huge amount of food, and hunting and trapping and gathering from the surrounding forest would always be a constant necessity, growing harder the more they depleted the local wildlife. If they did strike there and decided to stay, they would have to cultivate. Another huge labor. Jorvig had his tools and rope with him, harnessed to his otherwise empty pack. Since the others hadn't yet approached him about assigning tasks, he wanted to take advantage of the day and inspect the dell himself. Sledgefist and Hobblefoot were certain that this was an ideal location. He wanted to be certain too before he poured out his sweat in delving. It wasn't that he didn't trust them. Jorvig stopped himself from finishing that thought. He didn't want to think of the implications. He thought of them anyway. They'd never try to trick him, he knew, but they might trick themselves. The dell was formed around a vernal spring that flowed with meltwater or rainfall down the side of the mountain. It joined the artesian well there in the basin of the dell and flowed toward the river. At this time of the summer, the exposed cobbles and rock of the vernal stream were dry. The dell grew narrower further up the ridge until it disappeared into the wooded face of the mountain. At its widest point near the river, the dell was a little shy of 500 yards across. The mine audit was located against the curve of the dell's northern edge, where exposed sandstone was too steep even for gnarled pine to grasp. There was a seam there, 2 folds of rock joining with a line of mineralizations at the confluence. Without doubt, it was the same seam that the others were mining below. There was a clatter from behind as Warmcoat shook the top sluice, moving the sediment from beneath the larger bits of stone he had just dumped there. The flowing water would carry the lighter materials down into the next sluice, and the next, stratifying it. The heavier minerals, like gold, would fall to the bottom, caught in the slats in the wood. It was the same concept as panning for gold flakes and dust, just bigger, using the flowing water for the bulk of the labor. Having an active true spring was a boon to the claim, but it didn't matter if there wasn't anything to strike but quartz and iron alone. The tailings pond had backed up right to the edge of the rock face north of the adit, so Jorvig had to go all the way around, then begin climbing higher up the dell. He scrambled through the pine trees that clung more to the rock than the thin layer of loam on the slope. He pulled himself up with his hands by branches and exposed stone as much as walked. At a few points, he pulled his pick out and used it to help drag himself upward. The dell grew steep quickly. A few times he stopped to dislodge some of the surface scree and loam to get a look at the true rock below. It was still mostly sandstone, but there were intrusions here and there. Mostly quartz, but he also saw an igneous shaft running at an angle through the slope, nearly black. Such were the remains of the great cataclysm that had lifted and bent these hills. A few hundred yards up the slope, something on the western wall of the dell caught his eye, a dark streak in the rock. When he managed to shuffle over to investigate, he saw that the rock wasn't truly discolored. In fact, it was lighter than the surrounding stone. It was just an inward vertical fold, looking darker to the eye by the shadow of it. He tore away some of the moss with the end of his pick. A glint of quartz caught his eye. More quartz? Quartz of itself was not too exciting, but some veins of quartz contained gold, silver, copper. And they already knew from the trace deposits in the stream that there was gold somewhere along this ridge. He used hammer and round chisel to break off a chunk of the quartz that he could fit comfortably in his palm. He picked it up and examined it closer. There were no telltale inclusions, though he saw sand imperfections, which is about what he'd expect from quartz picked from a sandstone wall. His eyes drifted upward along the seam in the cliff, and about 50 feet above he noticed something else. From a distance, the tops of the conifers had blocked the view, but here he could see a second seam, a horizontal one crossing the vertical seam. Where the horizontal seam ran, the stone just beneath it jutted out, making a narrow shelf. This was the advantage of exposed rock faces like the western wall of the dell. It showed veins and seams and all the frozen movement of the rock. But greater things could always lurk unseen beneath a thin layer of loam or moss. Jorvig headed further up the dell, hoping to find the seam where the slope rose to meet it. He had to make his way another 30 yards before he found where it met the slope. He wanted to reach the junction of the two seams. Who knew what confluence of minerals and ancient energy had joined there during the cataclysm? While Jorvig's folk knew that aeons ago a great cataclysm had rent the world, they did not know much more except that it must have been hot and powerful beyond imagining. Reaching the joint was not possible. The stone beneath the horizontal seam jutted out a few inches, but not enough to walk upon. Above the joint, the rock face continued up, broken only by occasional crumbling shelves, then sloping up as a steep pine-covered arm of the ridge above. Jorvig sighed. It took him another hour before he managed to position himself on that tree-covered slope over the location of the joint. He'd secured the end of his rope on the sturdiest pine available, with the other hitched in a familiar miner's harness of square knots and loops that secured him from shoulders to hips. He walked backward to the edge and looked down. The pine he'd chosen was a couple yards to the side of the joint. Though he couldn't see the joint itself, he had stripped branches from a tree in front of it and peeled away the bark, leaving a white streak of inner tree flesh to gauge the location at a distance. Stepping back, he released the rope through his hands and slowly let himself begin the walk down the near vertical rock face. He was able to pause and rest on a few of the shelves between himself and the joint, but it took less than 10 minutes to lower himself parallel to the joint itself, and then walk sideways across the rock face. He planted the toes of his hobnailed boots on the narrow ledge, then secured the rest of the rope in a few neat coils around himself. There wasn't much left over. He could have alerted the others and had someone else spot for him, but he didn't think they would have stopped from their labor. Sledgefist would try to discourage it or outright forbid it, saying they'd already surveyed the dell. Yet dwarves in the mines were used to such dangers, and if he died, at least he wouldn't have to listen to the others berate him for his adventure. He didn't come out to the wilderness without intending to risk. There was less moss on the rock this high up, but the tops of some of the pines still rose above him. A crow cawed angrily. He took a moment to look around. He could see almost the whole dell, here looking less like a great dimple in the ridge than two great protective arms of stone reaching down toward the river. A breeze blew against his face, and he took a deep breath, smelling the strong scents of loam and sandstone and moisture. The seam glinted with hints of quartz, and he steadied himself against the rope and slid his hammer and a round chisel out from a satchel at his side. After considering, he placed his chisel and struck, releasing the sharp tang of quartz smell as the old weathered face flaked to reveal the brighter stone beneath. It wasn't long before he dislodged a chunk of stone from the seam. It was a conglomerate sample, varied faces of quartz against the sandstone matrix, but there were other mineralizations there. He held the sample up to the light. Like a dusting across the quartz, speckles of color glinted there. He tasted it, smelled it, and picked at it with a fingernail. Some of it was pyrite, he could tell, but maybe not all of it. And pyrite was an indicator mineral itself. No matter where he saw such a sample, he'd want to mine the spot further. Had the others not come to this place to test during their survey of the dell? There was no sign of previous work. The spring flowed out at their chosen adit, sure, so it made sense to dig there. But he hadn't seen anything in the seam they'd dug quite as promising as this. It was an easier place to dig, the bottom of the dell at the base of the cliff. Certainly easier than here, 50 feet above a steep slope. Sure, make a base camp at the water. It would also take a lot of effort just to start the mining process here. Someone eager to begin may not be so eager to try this site. An access would have to be created before any serious work could be done. Jorvig worked late into the night. He wanted to avoid running into the others, though anyone could have heard the strikes of chisel and pick anywhere in the dell if they'd stepped out. He didn't know how long the others' tolerance of him pursuing his own designs would last. Sleep came almost instantly when he did lie down in the storeroom and left just as fast. When his eyes opened, he was already thinking about the work. He'd slept in his clothes and he rose fast, grabbing his tools and stepping out into the dim adit drift. "Good waking, little cousin," Hobblefoot said. The dwarf was leaning against the drift wall, smoking a pipe. He must have been rationing his hill smoke fiercely to have any left. Jorvig had smoked the last of his halfway through his trek to the claim. As if hearing Jorvig's thoughts, Hobblefoot explained, "I saved the last bit just for this morning." "Why this morning?" Hobblefoot pulled the pipe from his mouth and smiled. "Have you forgotten the day, little cousin?" Jorvig did not like being called little cousin. No matter how kindly it was meant, there was something patronizing about it. Still, it was a common phrase, and there was no use trying to change the familial expressions of their folk, and going against them could only cause trouble. One did not want such trouble in a mine, especially not a claim in the wilderness. "Why, what day?" It's Day of Deliverance. To be continued. If the video is deleted, it will remain in the Boosty Mojo English dub, or if you want to support my endeavors, please subscribe to my Boosty in the description. Mojo English dub.